Well, greetings. I'm delighted to have my fellow principal at DI Advisors, Len Elliott, on our show today. Len is an experienced hotel real estate and transaction executive. In the last 30 years, she has held leadership positions at KPMG Consulting, IHG, and W Hotels in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. She was at Host Hotels and Resorts for 10 years and closed on over $7 billion of transaction. She now has her own company, Acacia Hospitality. Aside from her impressive work experience, Len is also well known in industry as the co-chair of Castell at College. It's a nonprofit dedicated to helping women advance their careers in the hospitality industry, and it's part of the American Hotel Lodging Association Foundation. Well, welcome, Len.
Thank you, David, for inviting me today, but also for having the vision to create DEI Advisors. I am so honored to be working with you and Rachel Humphrey. I am such an admirer of both of you, and I'm very grateful to work with both of you and have the opportunity to really interview my heroes within the industry as part of DEI Advisors.
Well, the feeling is mutual. It's great to have you. Now, Rachel, Len, you've had an impressive career. Can you share with us some highlights of your career journey and the factors that contributed to your success?
Sure. So there were a few key inflection points in my career. I think the first one is really transitioning from consulting to ownership when I left KPMG and joined Host. I had been a hospitality real estate consultant up to that point, which was actually my dream job coming out of school. And one of my favorite projects when I was at KPMG, where we both actually happened to work for a period of time, one of my favorite projects was conducting due diligence for a Singaporean owner who was buying hotels in Manhattan. And around that time, my husband got a job at Marriott and we moved from Miami to DC. And I could have looked for another consulting role, but I really wanted to move from advising owners who were buying hotels to being on the principal side, making those decisions as the owner on which hotels to buy and why. Another inflection point would be moving to Brussels to lead W Hotels development for Europe, Africa, Middle East. At the time, I'd been working on a $4 billion transaction to buy 35 Starwood hotels when I was at Host. And a number of those properties included W Hotels. And lifestyle hotels back then were relatively new. So I got to know first from an investment standpoint, but the W role gave me the opportunity to learn about lifestyle hotels from the brand side, how to sell them, what owners were looking for from the brand. And it was really my first time moving from the ownership side of the negotiating table to the brand side. And I found having negotiated deals from both perspective as an owner and as a brand really helped me understand both sides of the business. And it gave me a lot of credibility dealing with owners and brands in my future role. And the third inflection point is forming Acacia Hospitality. In the past, I helped my companies invest in hotels. Acacia was a big, scary step to invest my own capital in hotels, but we started by putting in sweat equity and built it up from there. In terms of success factors, I'd first mention something I learned from Chris Nassetta, which is the impact of being present when talking to someone. And I tried really hard to emulate his ability to make people feel special when he speaks with them. And I was in a leadership course once, and I was trying to figure out what makes Chris such a compelling leader. And this was one of the qualities that I really admire in him. So it's something I try to do. I think another success factor is my willingness to dig deep and learn how to do difficult things. So as an example, when I started leading my team at IHG, I tried emulating my boss's style. And as you might guess, that didn't go really well. But I had a great executive coach who did a 360 and worked with me on a plan to help me find my own authentic leadership style. But it was really hard. Kurt Castell, who was the CEO of IHG Americas when I first joined, has a great saying, which is the hardest work you'll ever do is on yourself. And I found that to be really true. And, were there hard things to read in that 360? Yes. In fact, my coach was worried I'd take the feedback and toss it in the trash and just walk away. But I made a conscious choice to do the work. And there were definitely moments I had to push myself and force myself to be uncomfortable so I could grow and be a better leader for my team. But when I saw my team really start to thrive, it encouraged me to keep going. So being willing to learn how to do difficult things, I think that's a factor in my success too.
Well, thanks for sharing those factors to your success. Those are key learning for you and for a lot of people. Appreciate you sharing that. And certainly Chris Nacella and Castell, legends in our industry. They are both tremendous leaders and great mentors. Talking about mentors, how have you had many mentors in your life, in your career? And what about champions, someone who advocates for your success?
I think both are really important, actually much more than I knew for most of my career, to be honest. I had a few really great champions, especially early on in my career, and there were the ones I knew about, right? Doug Henry and Doug Green, who I worked for at Host, I should say. And it was because of them advocating for me that I was able to lead my first hotel transaction when I was 28 years old. But there were also others who helped me from behind the scenes. Elizabeth Abdu, their general counsel, Pamela Wagner, the head of HR, also at Host. I actually didn't find out that they had advocated for me until many years later. But I honestly wish I had cultivated more mentors and champions. It would have really benefited me. Having said that, being one of a few women and a person of color as well, it was very hard for me to feel I could be vulnerable enough to ask for help. Another thing, while I knew about mentors who would help guide you and provide advice, I didn't really understand what a champion was, or an advocate or a sponsor, other words for a champion, until about 3 years ago when I watched a TED Talk by Carla Harris, who is one of the few Black women leaders in investment banking. And I watched that TED Talk where she explained what a champion is, and it was a light bulb moment for me. And I knew then that I wanted many more young people to be aware of champions and that they needed to identify and cultivate them throughout their career.
Yeah, in many ways, and a lot of people have said this also, champions are even more important than mentors because they can help you with your career advancement.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the fact that some of us in the underrepresented groups sometimes have this imposter syndrome. The feeling of the fact that because we are different, we don't belong, or that we're not comfortable because of the lack of diversity. Have you had that? And if so, how do you overcome that negativity in your head?
Absolutely, I do. When I got into real estate, though, there were so few women. I actually expected to be the only woman on the team or in the room. So it was more about being prepared and getting on with it. The constructive thing for me was focusing on doing my work as well as I could. So, for example, when I negotiated contracts to buy or sell hotels, I leaned into my natural curiosity and asked a lot of questions. And if I didn't understand something in a contract, I asked my lawyers. And I was very lucky to have great attorneys along the way who were willing to teach me, particularly Michael Goodwin and Catherine Olson at Arnold & Porter, Kenneth Hatton when I was at W in Europe, Paul Huang at IHG. These are all really brilliant attorneys who saw that I had an interest and taught me how to read my contracts, which helped me negotiate them better. And I just worked as hard as I could to be prepared. And over time, really knowing my business backwards and forwards gave me confidence when I walked in a room. So, for example, when I was leading my team at IHG, it was comprised of mostly men. And I'd sometimes walk into a room to meet an owner accompanied by one of my team members. And the owner would approach my colleague thinking he was the senior person from IHG. But by then, I had enough confidence not to let that bother me. I knew once we sat down and started talking that they would get it. And in terms of diversity, though, at the table, I do think things have improved a lot since I first started. I saw this in one of my last deals at IHG, where we worked on the hotel that is now the Alton, a New Kimpton hotel at Fisherman's Wharf, which is a wonderful property. And it was a very complex deal with lots of moving parts and lots of players. But what we discovered kind of in the middle of the deal was that on every side of that transaction, we had women leading the deal. We even had lead attorneys who were women. And it was just refreshing to have had that opportunity. But, you know, I obviously want to give a shout out to the men on the deal side of this industry too, because many of them are great friends I've made along the way, and I've loved working with them. But what I find is really interesting about imposter syndrome that I've learned from watching and doing these interviews with DEI advisors is that it never goes away. You think when you're younger that it's something that you're going to conquer and it goes away and you don't have it. But what I've seen is it stays with you all the way to the top. But I think it's something that you can use. So when you do something that's new, those butterflies are going to come back. But if you use that and you lean into it and use it to propel yourself forward, it can actually be an advantage for you.
No, that's so true. I totally agree with you on that. It never goes away, but you can use it in a very constructive way. Appreciate you sharing that. Now, from when you described your career journey and the inflection points, it seems like you've taken a fair number of calculated risks, and they have helped you with your career progression. Would you mind to elaborate on your thoughts of taking calculated risks?
It's funny you say that, because I actually think of myself as a fairly risk averse person in general. But I think a good example of taking a risk was leaving Host to join W Hotels in Brussels in their regional headquarters. And I thought it was a big risk because when I was approached about that W role, I felt I had one of the best jobs in hospitality real estate. I was doing deals, working closely with Chris Nassetta and Jim Rizzolio. But really, after 10 years, I also really felt the need to grow and the opportunity to live in Europe, to be closer to my stepfather who was living in France at the time, and to learn how to do business over there and live overseas. It was just all really intriguing. And by taking that leap, I learned so much while I was at W. Moving from the ownership side of the negotiating table to the brand management side was fascinating. And I have to admit, it was a bit fun for me to use some of those great negotiating points that I had heard so many times coming from managers across the table. When I finally got to use some of those points, so there was a little bit of satisfaction there. But I also learned about lifestyle brands, which were relatively new back then, and doing deals with people from all over the world. And also really important, how to navigate a large brand organization, which helped me ramp up very quickly when I joined IHG several years later. But really, as a life experience, I think everyone should live overseas for a period of time.
I agree with you on that too. It really broadens your horizon, and you adopt a totally different perspective when you're able to do that. Let's talk about challenges. We've all had them. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's business. What's your general approach to challenges?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I love to do difficult things and I love a good challenge. In fact, the team I started at IHG is focused on handling owner issues that threaten IHG's franchise agreements and management agreements. So it was all about dealing with challenges. And what I learned from doing that is that there are really two kinds of mindsets. The first one are people who look at a situation like that and think, why would I want to spend my time working on things that are broken? And then there's another mindset, another group of people who will approach it as a challenge to be overcome. And it's where they think no one else has been able to untangle this knot yet, or it's an opportunity to solve a puzzle. And as I mentioned, I'm in that second group. So I love working on something that hasn't been done before. But the way I approach challenges usually is, first I step back and do my homework. So I'm going to gather the documents to know what I have to work with, read everything that I can, then talk to as many people who can share the history and the perspective of the situation, as well as information about the people involved. And then finally, we obviously run the analysis, quantify the issue and the available options. But I think part of the process is getting comfortable that you'll never have every answer you need before you have to make a decision. And you don't want to get sucked into analysis paralysis, which I see happen a lot. Just make the best decision you can with the information you have. In most situations, if you need to, you can go back and adjust if you need to. But I'd say the most important thing about working on challenging things is to surround yourself with people who thrive in that environment.
Yeah, I do agree with you on that as well. I like your thought about it's a process. You aren't going to come up with a solution that's 100% perfect, but you keep iterating and you keep improving and you will overcome that challenge. You come up with a great solution. I like that. And surrounding yourself with good people, that's something that every leader should aspire to be able to achieve.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about setbacks and disappointments. Obviously, these are wonderful learning opportunities. Don't get ahead unless you have failed. And I'm sure you've had your fair share of setbacks and disappointments. What are some of your learnings that you can share with us?
Yeah, there was a time when I was at a company and the leadership changed. And unfortunately, the new leader's core values didn't align with mine. In my role, I was negotiating with owners for very lucrative long-term management contracts. And I saw my leaders dismantling the elements that created value for my owners. The owners couldn't see it. It was happening behind the scenes. And I'm not sure if leadership understood what they were doing or not, but I could see that over the long term, the product I was selling at a premium would be unable to deliver. And at that point, I knew I had to leave, as I couldn't sell something I no longer believed in. So for me, it was about staying true to who I was and what I represented. Unfortunately, I didn't fully grasp that I was entering what would be the Great Recession. So it was hard to find another job when I left. But the silver lining was I had nothing to lose in starting Acacia Hospitality with my husband. And we had worked well together on the W London Leicester Square deal, which is a very difficult deal that took 2+ years to negotiate. And having worked on that project with him made me comfortable we could successfully work together at Acacia. And so we set up Acacia in early 2010, partnering with Doug Green, one of my mentors from Host, to invest in hotels with our private equity partners. But I think just going back to when you're going through difficult things, I think going back to your core values and what's important to you, that's just really important.
Yeah, no, I agree with you totally. Reminding yourself of your core values is so important. Yeah. Now, you alluded to this earlier. You were in a field that's dominated by men. I think 20, 30 years ago when you joined the industry in your field, development was a field that's dominated by men. How did you manage to break through in such a difficult environment?
Well, in some ways it was easy, in some ways it wasn't. I'd say in terms of breaking through, as one of the few women back then, I was probably easier to remember. But it took me years to understand that this was actually an advantage. And since I figured that out, I actively avoid wearing dark colors at investment conferences. So you might see me in red or something else, but I ensure that I don't blend in with the men in dark suits when I'm there. Another thing that I did was I learned to trust in a couple things that came natural to me. And I think may come naturally actually to other women and people in underrepresented groups. because early on, even though I got to be in the room, I did a lot of listening, not talking. But that honed my ability to truly listen, to hear what people were saying, and sometimes more importantly, what they weren't saying. And that proved invaluable to me when I started to negotiate my own deals. And then another skill that I discovered is that I have a great ability to read people, actually pretty well. And that really has helped guide me in how I work with people going forward. On the downside, I'm a naturally pretty direct and assertive person, and I found that not everybody is comfortable with that style, especially coming from a woman. So I've had to learn to balance that. I'd say in my 30s, I had to develop a pretty thick armor around me. But then in my 40s, I moved to Georgia and I came to embrace a Southern saying, which is you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And I learned to better balance being assertive. And of course, it's almost always better if you can start difficult things by asking nicely and starting off on a great footing. So as with all things, but I had to learn that in my work life as well.
Great lessons. Thanks for sharing that. Now, in your field especially, it's really important to know a lot of people and develop trust among all the people that you work with. What is your secret to building your vast network?
I think first I make it a priority to meet people in person because nothing replaces talking to someone face to face. Before the pandemic, a lot of deals were done completely by conference call. That was the pre-Zoom world. Can barely remember a pre-Zoom world. But I did many deals where I never actually met the person on the other side while we negotiated the deal, all the way through to closing. I didn't even know what they looked like. I just knew the sound of their voice. And so I always made it a point at investment conferences to meet as many people as possible while we're all in one place. And it's people that I'm currently working with and people that I've worked with in the past, because I find it makes it easier the second time around. And for me, I usually see it starts to click the second time you meet someone in person. Just so having those in-person touch points are so important. And I've had days at those conferences where I schedule myself back to back with 30-minute meetings, many meetings. And I've seen the top executives in our industry do it. I'm sure you've had those days with many meetings, David, but everyone can do it. It's a great opportunity to connect with many people. And then the other thing I do is I try to remember that hospitality is a deceptively small industry and that hospitality relationships are marathons, not sprints. You never know when someone will turn up on the other side of the table and you may need something from them. You might need your help and it might be really important. So treat people at every level of an organization with respect, take the high road if you can. But most importantly, I find always do what you say you're going to do. And I'm so grateful that some of my best friends are in the industry and are people I've met actually across the negotiating table. And that's not because either of us gave in on critical issues, but it's how you treat the other person during negotiations. Kevin Kearney, who was a brilliant deal guy with Marriott for many years and then with IHG, and he passed a couple years ago. But I often think of this great advice that he gave me when I was having a difficult time. And he said, it's not the what, it's the how. And I try to remember that, especially with difficult conversations. I can't say I'm perfect at it, but I really try to remember that.
Great advice. Thanks for sharing them. Now let's switch gears and talk about your leadership style. How would you describe that?
I think there are a few things that I think about as a leader. First, I always try to think about and treat my team as people first and employees second. I know that sounds super obvious, but it gets forgotten far too often. And trust me, people can tell the difference. I also believe that as a leader, I'm there to help my team shine. I'm going to set the bar pretty high, and I think I'm known for that, I've been told. But I believe my job is to help all of them get up there. And when I started my team at IHG, I was at this leadership course that I mentioned, and I set a big audacious goal for myself, which is that I wanted people to look at our team and think, wow, every single person on that team is a superstar. And one of the proudest moments of my career was when I shared that goal with Kevin Kearney, who I mentioned earlier, and he told me that I had actually accomplished that with my team. So that was really rewarding. Another thing I find is I like to surround myself with people who are smarter than me and who have a growth mindset, someone who's willing to learn and to grow and always be improving, and someone who thrives doing difficult things and scaling those figurative mountains, right? One thing I really like doing as a team is personality tests. And I know we've all done some of them, but I've done them as a team together. And I found that it teaches everyone so much about how each of us likes to get things done, how we want bad news communicated to us, what's rewarding for each person, because it's different for everyone. It's not just money, right? And that really allowed me to tailor my approach for each team member to help them be as successful as possible.
Well, your servant leadership and inclusive style had served you very well. You should be proud. Now, related to that is your advice to leaders on how to help the underrepresented, because sometimes those are hard conversations. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Something I've learned is that there are things that come more naturally to men, and other things that come more naturally to women. I've had a couple male bosses over the years who would, for example, invite me to a business reception where there would be clients I didn't know. I'd walk into a room of complete strangers. And in hindsight, I realized those invitations were actually a test to see how I performed. And in my experience, that is not a good way to determine if a woman is ready for the next step. And this is why. With a life experience of dealing with unconscious bias, unless the woman is a true extrovert and loves walking into a room full of strangers, this isn't a situation where she's likely to shine. Instead, if you really want to develop them as leaders in those kinds of situations, I'd advise having them stay near you early on, introducing them to a few owners, leading with a topic they have in common, then stepping away and letting them continue the conversation. Or you could also plant a few owners in the room, that owners that they've worked with before, and see how and if they interact with them. Now, I think some viewers are going to view this as spoon feeding women, but I think it's a way to help someone overcome a skill that doesn't come naturally. And I believe if the benchmarks that people use to measure employees and team members, if they skew towards skills that come more naturally to men, women are always going to be at a disadvantage. So I think about the leadership qualities and skills through a lens of what plays more naturally to one group's strengths to another. And I'd also add that being uncomfortable walking to a room full of strangers isn't just an issue for women, right? I mean, a lot of people have this issue. The key is, if you want more diverse leaders, you may have to coach and support them to develop skills that don't come naturally. And don't just lay out a test and judge them. Find ways that you can help them be more well-rounded so that they're ready for the next step. For me, that's a big part of being a great leader, is someone who can develop a diverse team.
I totally agree with you on that. And I think another piece of advice I would offer is everyone is different, and it shouldn't be one size fits all. Some of us are introverts, some of us are extroverts, some of us are very comfortable in a social setting, some of us are less so, but it doesn't mean that we can't get there. We just need the help and advice to be able to do that effectively.
Absolutely.
But anyway, thanks for sharing that. Now, you've come a long way, and as you look back, what's your advice to your younger self?
I mentioned earlier being more open to asking for help, that I didn't have to do it all myself. The other piece of advice I'd give to myself is to keep a little framed serenity prayer at my desk, like I did at my last job. And I don't know if you know the serenity prayer. It goes, "Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." And I tell my younger self that you'll drive yourself crazy trying to take on everything. It took me decades, but the importance of gaining the wisdom to discern what to take on, it is so important to know when to pick your battles.
That is so true. That is so true. When I think back to my younger days, I was so anxious to get ahead and to achieve my career objectives that sometimes I drive myself too hard, and you hit a wall sometimes. And I always say our career journey is a marathon, and you can't be thinking of it like a sprint. You have to take your
Yeah.
time and cross train and get a lot of exposure and build a good foundation. So that's great advice. Now, you are very active as the co-chair of Castell at College, and you speak at a lot of universities. What's the advice that you offer the students?
So actually at Castell at College, one of our secret sauce is to not give advice. It's to share stories, but we do share advice in the form of stories. But I'd offer a few bits of advice that I would share with young people, especially ones that I mentor. One of them is, rather than chasing title or money, choose jobs where you have the opportunity to work with great people who are willing to teach you. That is far more valuable, especially at the beginning of your career. I've always looked to find how I can work closely with really amazing people in our industry, and it's taught me a tremendous amount. The second thing I would do, and I thought about doing it and I never did it, was to join Toastmasters, because I know you've done it, David. And I recently learned that public speaking is people's number one fear. It actually beats death and spiders, which surprised me. But with practice, I do think it gets easier to do. And there are also coaches who can help you. I had a coach for a keynote address that I recently gave, and it was a huge help. So I should probably add Toastmasters as advice I would give to my younger self, to actually take that advice when I thought about it 30 years ago.
Great advice. Well, I'm afraid that we're out of time, but thank you, Len, for sharing your wisdom with us. And thank you also for serving the industry so selflessly. I admire your passion and dedication in helping women and other underrepresented groups achieve their career aspiration. So thank you. And I'm also
Thank you.
grateful to the audience for tuning in. And if you like this interview, I hope you visit us on our website, deiadvisors.org, and you would find plenty more interviews on that website. I hope to see you there. Thank you.